A 12-gauge slug hits harder than anything else a person can reasonably carry into bear country. A 454 Casull carries easier than that shotgun. A 10mm gives a shooter more chances than either one. And a rifle beats all three, right up until the moment it leaves the shooter's hands. So, which one is actually the best Grizzly gun? By the end of this, there will be a named winner for camp, a named winner for the trail, a named winner for the hunter who is already carrying a rifle, and one firearm that most people watching should not buy for this job at all. 3 things to hold on to before the first candidate. The most powerful gun in this comparison does not win the final ranking. One of these firearms, on federal paperwork, requires written permission before an employee may carry it. The reason is not what most people assume, and the handgun wins one category for the exact same reason it loses every single ballistic comparison on the list. Most videos on this question are a table full of guns and a set of opinions. This one is a scoring system. Here are the rules. Every firearm in this comparison gets measured against the same 7 criteria: immediate accessibility, penetration and projectile behavior, controllability and recovery, reliability under stress, portability, training demand, and mission fit. That last one matters more than any other, because there is no such thing as bear country in the abstract. There are 3 completely different jobs. The first is camp, a fixed location, a cabin, a tent, a field station, a work site. The firearm can be heavy because it is not being carried all day. It only has to be within reach. The second is the trail, fishing, hiking, photographing, packing gear, moving all day with both hands occupied. The firearm has to survive contact with reality, which means it has to still be on the person after 8 hours. The third is the hunt. The shooter is already carrying a capable long gun for another reason entirely. And every candidate faces the same final question. Call it the 3-second test. If a large animal closes distance right now, is that firearm in the hands, pointed, and capable of a controlled second shot before the situation resolves itself? 4 candidates pass that test. The one that fails is not the one most people expect. Start with the heaviest hitter. A 1-ounce 12-gauge slug leaves the muzzle carrying roughly 2,300 foot-pounds of energy. That is nearly 4 times the muzzle energy of a heavy 10mm load, and more than 2.5 times a 4-inch .44 Magnum. On raw numbers, it is not close. But the more interesting evidence is not on a ballistics chart, it is in a policy document. Glacier National Park's management directive states that the park issues only 12-gauge shotguns and solid slug ammunition to non-law enforcement employees for animal protection. The preferred weapon is named in the document. It is a Remington Model 870 with a 3-inch chamber. An employee who wants to carry a .44 Magnum handgun or rifle instead, or a personal weapon of any kind, must obtain written permission from the chief ranger. The required training program includes a minimum of 4 hours of classroom time plus a prescribed shooting course. That is the written permission detail from the opening. And here is the part that most people get wrong when they hear it. This is not proof that a shotgun is the best bear gun for every hunter, angler, and hiker in North America. It is proof of something narrower and more useful. An agency choosing a firearm is not solving the same problem an individual is solving. An agency has to standardize training across hundreds of people with wildly different backgrounds. It has to manage armories, maintenance, and replacement cost. It carries legal liability if an employee is killed, and it often needs that same platform for other wildlife management tasks. The 12-gauge wins that specific problem because it is the platform that can be taught fastest, to the widest range of people, at the lowest cost, with the fewest failure modes. The training history behind that policy runs deeper than most people realize. The United States Geological Survey built its firearms safety program for defense against wild animals in 1978, after a near-fatal attack on a survey geologist during the 1977 field season in Alaska. That attack involved a black bear, not a grizzly. It did not settle any caliber question. What it did was force an agency to convert an argument into a written equipment and training standard. And even then, no agency produced one universal answer. Here is the contradiction that makes this interesting. The same agency that hands its own field employees a 12-gauge tells its visitors something entirely different. The National Park Service states that bear spray is the recommended self-defense tool against a bear, that it is easy to use without much experience, and that firearms are not a substitute for proper bear avoidance. It also notes that a bear wounded by a firearm can become more dangerous, which puts rangers and other visitors at risk if that animal has to be tracked. In Glacier, visitors may legally carry a firearm under federal law dating to 2010, but discharging one inside the park is illegal. So which is it? Is that hypocrisy, or is it proof that a trained employee and a weekend visitor are solving two genuinely different problems? That question belongs in the comments, because it is the honest fault line in this entire debate. Now the other side of the shotgun. It is heavy. It is long. It occupies both hands. Every one of those traits is acceptable at a fixed camp and disqualifying on a trail. A pump action requires a precise, complete stroke under stress. That is a learnable skill, but it is a skill, and it degrades faster than people expect when adrenaline arrives. And the single largest weakness has nothing to do with ballistics. A shotgun leaning against a tree 10 feet away has a muzzle energy of 0, not reduced, 0. It is not a defensive tool at that point. It is an object. The 3-second test verdict for the 12-gauge is a pass, with a condition attached in bold. It passes only while it is in the hands. Which brings up the most popular practical answer in Alaska. The 10mm earned its reputation honestly, and most explanations of why are far too shallow. The usual version is more rounds. That is the least important reason. The real case is a stack of 6 things. It is light enough to wear on the body for an entire working day without a decision being made to leave it behind. It offers meaningful capacity. It allows a fast follow-up shot. Its recoil sits below the threshold where most shooters begin to flinch. It is available in heavy, flat-nosed, deep penetrating loads. And critically, it is a platform that a normal person will actually practice with, several hundred rounds a year, without dreading the range session. That last point is the whole argument. A firearm's real-world performance is capped by how well the person behind it can run it. But there are 2 hard limits that deserve to be said plainly. A 10mm does not turn a handgun into a rifle. It closes some of the gap to a .44 Magnum. It does not close the gap to a shoulder-fired weapon, and no amount of marketing changes that. And not every 10mm load is equivalent. Advertised velocity figures frequently come from test barrels longer than the pistol in question, which means real-world numbers land lower. More importantly, heavy flat-nosed projectiles do not always feed and cycle reliably in every semi-automatic. That combination of a specific pistol and a specific load has to be verified by actually shooting it. It cannot be assumed from a box label. Now the classic compromise. The .44 Magnum has been the default answer to this question for longer than most people watching have been alive, and the reason is that it sits at a genuine balance point. Heavier projectile than the 10mm, deeper penetration potential with the right bullet, still controllable by a committed shooter. But the 4-inch .44 and the 6.5-inch .44 should be treated as 2 different firearms, because operationally they are. The short barrel gives up real velocity. It produces noticeably more muzzle blast. It is dramatically easier to wear all day, which means it is more likely to be present. The longer barrel recovers velocity and gives a longer sight radius, and it is the one more likely to be left in the truck. Nobody is choosing a caliber there. They are choosing which compromise they are willing to live with. And there is a mechanical advantage to the revolver that rarely gets credit. Heavy, flat-nosed bullets that can cause feeding problems in a semi-automatic are simply not a functional issue in a cylinder. Nothing has to feed. Nothing has to cycle. That is not sentiment about revolvers. That is an engineering fact, and in a category where deep, penetrating, flat-nosed bullets are the preferred projectile, it matters. Hold on to the .44 Magnum. 3 minutes from now, a single number is going to reorder this entire ranking. Now the most powerful handgun on the table. The .454 Casull is a serious tool used by serious people, and nothing here is going to pretend otherwise. It produces roughly 1,600 foot-pounds at the muzzle with a heavy load, which is nearly double a short-barreled .44 Magnum. The question is not whether it is powerful. The question is what that power costs. Most discussions of recoil are useless because they are adjectives. Snappy, stout, brutal. Those words describe a feeling, not a measurement. So here is a measurement. Recoil velocity is how fast the firearm moves backward toward the shooter, and it is what actually determines how long it takes to get the sights back on target. It is calculated from projectile weight, published velocity, and the weight of the firearm. Running the same math across all 5 candidates produces something genuinely surprising. A 10mm pistol comes back at roughly 14 feet per second. A 4-inch .44 Magnum, about 19. The .454 Casull, about 22. The 12-gauge, firing a slug with roughly 4 times the muzzle energy of that 10mm, comes back at about 13 feet per second. Slower than the .44. Slower than the .454. The rifle is slower still, at roughly 11. To be precise about the method, those figures are estimated from published projectile weight and published velocity, and do not include the mass of propellant gases, which means the real values are somewhat higher across the board. They are useful for comparing platforms against each other, not as absolute values. But the ranking holds, and the ranking is the point. The shotgun generates far more energy and moves toward the shooter more slowly, because the firearm itself is heavy and because it braces against a shoulder instead of pivoting on 2 wrists. That is the real reason an agency can take an inexperienced employee and produce a functional shooter in 4 hours of classroom time and a qualification course. Nobody is doing that with a .454. So the honest statement about the most powerful handgun in this comparison is not that it is a bad choice. It is that a firearm is only powerful on paper if recoil delays the second shot past the point where it matters, or if the first shot never lands where it was intended. For a shooter who has genuinely put in the work, the .454 remains a legitimate answer. For everyone else, it is a tax being paid in recovery time, which raises the fairest question in this entire debate. Would a person rather have the cartridge with the highest energy figure or the platform that permits the fastest accurate follow-up shot? Now the candidate that wins almost everything. A suitable centerfire rifle, something in the class of a .35 Whelen, produces roughly 3,200 foot-pounds at the muzzle. It has the highest sectional density in this group. It has the longest sight radius. It has the lowest recoil velocity. It is fired from the shoulder with 3 points of contact. Measured criterion by criterion, the rifle wins penetration, wins controllability, wins effective distance, and wins accuracy potential. It is not close. It loses exactly one criterion: immediate accessibility on a mobile mission. And that single loss is not a small footnote, because accessibility is the one criterion that cannot be compensated for by caliber. Every other weakness on this list has a hardware solution. That one does not. So here is the sharpest version of the rifle argument, and it deserves to be taken seriously by anyone who hunts. The rifle already being carried is very likely a better primary bear defense firearm than any handgun that could be purchased for the purpose. But only for exactly as long as that rifle remains within reach. And for a hunter, that window closes at a very specific and very predictable moment. It closes when the rifle gets set down to begin field dressing an animal, which is the precise moment the smell of blood enters the equation. That is the gap, not the caliber, the gap. So the real question for a hunter is not which Magnum revolver has the most energy. It is whether adding one improves the system or whether it just adds weight and confidence that has not been earned. Now the part that reorders everything, and the part where the standard version of this discussion falls apart. There is a familiar test in bear gun content. A heavy bullet is fired at a steel target. The steel swings hard, and the audience is invited to conclude something about penetration. That test measures one thing. It measures momentum transferred into a piece of steel. It says nothing at all about whether a projectile will drive through thick hide, dense muscle, and heavy bone, and it says nothing about whether that projectile will hold a straight line after hitting bone at an angle. Steel is a good visual. It is not a penetration test, and the honest presenters admit that on camera, even while the footage does the persuading anyway. So what does predict deep penetration? The single most underrated number in this entire conversation is sectional density. It is projectile weight divided by the square of its diameter. In plain terms, it describes how much mass is concentrated behind each square inch of frontal area, and it is one of the better predictors of how deep a projectile drives. Here is where the 5 candidates land. The .35 Whelen bullet sits around 0.28, the .454 Casull around 0.25, the .44 Magnum around 0.24, the 10mm around 0.18, and the 1-ounce 12-gauge slug, the projectile with by far the highest muzzle energy in this comparison, sits at roughly 0.12, lower than the 10mm. A slug is an enormous amount of lead spread across an enormous frontal area. All of that energy has to be pushed through a very wide hole, and wide holes are expensive to drive deep. Now the necessary caution, because this number gets abused constantly. Sectional density is one variable, not the whole picture. Projectile construction, hardness, nose shape, and impact velocity all participate. This does not mean a shotgun penetrates worse than a handgun. What it means is this: the 12 gauge is the platform with the widest gap between the right ammunition and the wrong ammunition. A soft, hollow-based slug designed to deform on deer and a hard, solid slug designed for large, heavy animals are not remotely the same tool, even though both fit the same chamber. On every other platform in this comparison, ammunition selection shifts performance. On the shotgun, it decides the outcome. Which leads to the last thing, and the thing that separates people who have thought about this from people who have only read about it. Hardcast is not a magic word. Saying it does not accomplish anything. 3 things have to be true. The projectile has to function reliably in that specific firearm, verified by actually shooting it, not assumed. The point of impact has to be confirmed at realistic distance, because heavy loads frequently print noticeably away from where lighter loads print in the same gun, and a firearm sighted for one and loaded with the other is a firearm the shooter does not actually know. And it has to be ammunition the shooter is willing to fire often enough to stay familiar with. A perfect projectile in a gun that has never been verified with it is a guess wearing the costume of a plan. So, scorecard. Across the 7 criteria, the 10mm posts the highest average. It is not because it is the most powerful. It is because it has the fewest weaknesses across all 3 missions. The 12 gauge and the rifle post lower averages for the opposite reason. Each one dominates absolutely in exactly one mission and collapses in the other 2. That is why an average score is the wrong way to read this table, and why every ranking that produces a single champion is producing a wrong answer. Here are the real answers. For a fixed camp, a work site, or a field station, with a trained user, the answer is a 12-gauge pump loaded with a slug built for large animals. The condition is not negotiable. It has to be within reach, and the operator has to have run that action enough times that it has stopped being a decision. For a hunter already carrying a capable centerfire rifle, the answer is that rifle. Adding a large revolver only makes sense if it rides on the chest and specifically covers the window when the rifle is set down. For a person moving all day with gear in both hands, fishing, hiking, packing, the answer is whichever handgun that particular shooter controls best, most often a properly configured 10mm or .44 Magnum, worn on the body, not stowed in a pack. This is the one category where the less powerful firearm wins outright, and it wins on the only criterion that cannot be purchased. For a highly practiced shooter who wants maximum handheld power, the .454 Casull is a legitimate choice, a deliberate one, not a default. And the firearm most people watching should not buy for this job is any large Magnum purchased a few weeks before a trip. Not because the caliber is wrong, because nobody develops control at that level in a few weeks. That money buys more safety as a bare safety course, a legal deterrent, and several hundred rounds through something manageable. The most powerful gun does not win. It never did. It only ever won the argument, which is a different contest entirely. 5 firearms on a table, and the honest answer was never one of them. It was the distance between the shooter and whichever one they chose. I have watched this argument run for years, And the thing that stays with me is how rarely anyone asks the only question that has ever mattered, which is not what is in the safe, but what is on the body. If you carry in country where something larger than you lives, and you have already thought about which of these fits your work rather than your wish list, you are the kind of person this channel is built for. Subscribe and stay in the conversation.